Hi, welcome to the Money Compass.
The show that will guide you through the world of money and finance.
With me, Emma Knights.
And me, Lukas Spyrou.
Exploring investments, retirement, taxes and protection.
And helping you navigate your way to financial success.
Today we're going to be talking about wills, so it's one of those topics that people don't particularly like to talk about.
Cheery subject.
It is, and I don't know if it's just a Norfolk thing, but it seems to be, if I make a will, that means I'm going to die, and people just seem to avoid doing it, and it comes across to me that it's a Norfolk thing, but I found a statistic that maybe says that that's not the case. So I found that 31 million adults in the UK don't have a will, and that's 59% of the population, the adult population in the UK.
Quite scary, actually, when you think about that.
Huge amount of people. And even worse, possibly, that only 6% of those adults that don't have a will have actually thought about making one.
Mm.
So that's a lot of people that haven't thought about it, let alone done it. Basically, their estate would pass under the rules of intestacy. So I know we've talked about that in the past. We're not going to go into that in too much depth today, but basically making a will is a really important thing to do to make sure that you choose who your estate passes on to, and it doesn't just get left by a set of rules that you have no say over. So
I think the last couple of years as well has really shown everyone that things happen that you don't expect. So yeah, it is vitally important that, you know, at least start thinking about putting this in place.
Most definitely. To make a will, you need to be over the age of 18, and you also need to have what's called testamentary capacity. So basically, the person who's making the will needs to understand what a will is, the extent of their estate and who they'll be passing it on to. So they need to understand what assets they actually have. And they need to know the moral and legal obligations that they have to certain people. So they need to know that if they have children under the age of 18, that they need to make provisions for them, things like that.
And can anyone write a will, Emma, or does it need to be someone professional or someone specific that needs to do it for you?
So it just needs to be in writing, and it needs to be signed and witnessed. So anybody can do it. You can do it yourself. You don't have to pay a small fortune to have one done. And they can be done at very, very low cost as well. So it's just a case of doing a little bit of research and making sure that you're going to be happy with it. Because ultimately, if you did it yourself and then you pass away, how would you feel if you could kind of look back down onto what's happening once you've gone and find actually what you've done wasn't valid? So sometimes it's worth paying a little to make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, to make sure that exactly what you want is going to happen.
Yeah. So we've touched on the points of you know, the things that have to happen to create the will. Like you said, you have to be over 18, but there's other things that you should be considering and that need to be covered in the will. And one of the most important things is who your executors and or the trustees are going to be. So your executors are those people that really are going to be the ones who are going to carry out your wishes. So you really need to sort of carefully select who you wish to use. You know, ideally it needs to be someone that you trust and to carry out your wishes.
And they have the ability to do it, because some people just wouldn't be able to. And there's nothing wrong with that. No. But some people wouldn't have the capability. So you need to choose someone that's going to be able to do it. At the end of the day, the things they're going to be doing is, if you have any debts, they'll need to repay any debts using your estate. And then they'll need to follow your will basically step by step to distribute things as you've chosen and carry out your wishes, such as what's going to happen at your funeral and things like that. So you need to choose someone that you can really rely on. Yeah. It's not a small task.
No, I mean, what we tend to find, I mean, we do wills with the sister company to Face Finance with our estate planning arm of the business. But what we tend to find is that most people would use their spouse or the partner as the first executor to carry out those wishes. As we said, we've touched on, you know, that's likely to be someone that you'd like to think someone that you trust and you know he's going to be capable. It's important to always remember that depending on your age of when you put it in place, it could be someone they need to definitely be over 18, and in an ideal world, someone who's younger than you, because although it's not guaranteed that they'll outlive you, there is a higher chance. So obviously that needs to be considered if you are thinking of putting a spouse or partner in place as your first executor.
And it's always just worth having more than one executor anyway. So they can be done so that they both have to work together, or it can be that your spouse or partner is your executor and then if they can't or don't want to act, then you can choose the backup. So it's always worth having some options in there, because, not being funny, if something happened to you, Lucas, I'd like to think that Zoe would be pretty upset.
Might need some assistance.
She might need some assistance. So it's thinking about what situation they're gonna be in at that time and what help they might need as well.
Quite vulnerable at that point, aren't they, as well?
Definitely, and
Hopefully.
it's a big burden to leave.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And another thing that you need to think of when the worst should happen is what you would like to happen at the funeral. Do you want to be buried, cremated, cast adrift on a Viking longboat? They're all types of things that need to be considered.
And a lot of people often say as well that they'd like to go to medical science, and I don't think people realise that you can't just put that in your will and it'll happen. You actually have to apply right now to be able to be given to medical science when you're gone. So you almost have to qualify for their criteria, and it might be that if you get illnesses or anything later in life, that actually they might not want you anymore. So if medical science is important to you, definitely worth finding out about. But it's always a good idea to have kind of a backup option just in case they can't take you for any reason at that time.
Yeah. And I mean, to go alongside the will, we would always recommend that you write a letter of what you want to happen, so that number one, that things can be changed rather than having to change the whole will. It gives a bit of guidance to your executors about what needs to happen.
So making sure those things are in black and white so that your executors know exactly what you would have wanted. And again, it takes away that burden from them at a time when they're really upset, that actually you've told them exactly what you want. They don't need to think about it, and they don't need to worry about would they have wanted this or would they have wanted that. They've got it written down of exactly what you would have wanted. And in that letter, you can include loads of different things, such as I'd like family flowers only, I'd like donations to go to this charity, I'd like a humanitarian service or a religious service or whatever it may be. So you can be as specific as you want to, or you can be really, really vague and say, I leave it to you, or even actually, I want the most minimal service possible, and I don't want to wake. It can literally be whatever you want it to be.
Following on from that, another major part of any will is, particularly if you've got children, is thinking about who you would want to become their guardians. And again, it's not a nice thing to think about, but if you've got young children, who, if the worst was going to happen, is going to be there for them. So again, it's it needs to be that person that you can trust and someone that can actually take on that responsibility. It is a bit of a myth that if you die without a will, that your children will be taken into care. So they would just be placed with who is deemed to be the most appropriate member of your family or the closest member of your family. But that might not particularly be the same person as you would have chosen. So again, like we said, writing your will and your letter of wishes of how you want your children to be brought up ultimately is really important factor. So if you've got young children, I know there'd be a lot of people, as we mentioned earlier, that haven't even thought about doing a will. They might think, I'm not old enough to do a will yet. But if you've got young children, I couldn't stress enough how important it is to get something in place, even if it's not for yourself. For the worst happen, and you weren't there for your children in future.
Yeah, and you can literally, again, in that letter, put anything. It could be the way you want them to ideally be educated, or a particular school you might like them to go to, or a particular place you might want them to go, or to ensure that they continue to have contact with particular family members. There could be so many things that actually are really important to you that if you were here, you would do, but actually if you weren't here, somebody else might not think to do that. You can be kind of quite specific about the things that you would wish to happen. But children are obviously very, very important, but to some people they may not have children. They may have pets which may be equally as important as children.
Some people's pets are their babies, aren't they? And
Exactly.
it's something we've actually see quite a lot of now, that and that is part of when we are taking will instructions for people now. We have got a section about what do you want to happen to your cat or your dog, and again,
and it's not necessarily the cat or dog you have right now. It could be the cat or dog at the time of your death. I know, and I'm sure my mum and dad won't mind me sharing this one. They have an African grey parrot that can live for around about 50 years.
Wow.
She's maybe about 20 now, but I have explicitly said, I do not want that bird if anything happens to you. All she's ever done is bite me. I do not like her. So I know my mum and dad have got in their will that Ruby, the parrot, will go to my sister, and they've even then left her an additional gift of money to make sure that she can continue to provide for her for the rest of her natural life.
Continue to live her life of luxury.
Most definitely, eating all the nuts that she wishes to eat and not chewing on Emma's fingers. So it can be done. So it's just important to take that into consideration. Now, some people would say, I'm not putting my pets in my will, and that's absolutely fine. So there's no right or wrong that you must put it in or you must not, but it's just something to consider.
There's something else to consider in it. So we've sort of set out where, who's going to carry out your wishes for you, who's going to look after the children and the pets. The next thing you need to consider is if you want to make any particular gifts. Now, they come into sort of two categories. We've got pecuniary legacies, which quite simply is a posh word for gifts of money. So if there's anything or anyone that you want to receive a specific amount of money, this is the section that you'd put it in. So if you want, a niece, a nephew to receive £5,000 before your estate is actually, your house and all of those bits are divvied up.
Or it could even be a charity. It could be, I know, you were always a Girl Guide and you want £500 to go to the Girl Guides or to your local church or a group that you're part of. It can literally be anybody, but it's just it tends to be a token amount of money. So it's not necessarily a considerable chunk of your estate.
Yeah, not the whole value or half the value of the estate. It's just
it's kind of a specific certain amount of money that you'd like to go to a person or kind of company, really.
Yeah. So, and then after the money, we've got legacies, which are then just particular gifts or physical gifts, if you will. So, again, this could be, you've got a special ring, a special bracelet.
An antique clock.
Anything like that.
A car, anything of a physical asset that you want to pass on to ensure that a certain person has. So, I think probably one of the most common ones that we'll see is a mother that might have two daughters, and then she'll choose one of her daughters to have the engagement ring and one to have the wedding ring. And it just saves any arguments. Now, I'd like to say that when a parent or anybody passes away, that everybody is very amicable and understanding of, oh no, I understand you'd like that or I'd like that. But you see it so often that it's the time when the vultures come out and actually everybody's out for themselves, not necessarily mourning that person. They're just in it for what can they get out of this.
Trying to get the best deal out of it for themselves, which is quite sad, really.
So from your point of view, that's why it's important to make sure that you set out anything that you would like to happen, because at least then nobody can argue about it. You've put it in black and white if that's what you want to happen, and there can be no arguments. All I would say is you need to be a little bit careful, because you don't want to go down to the minutiae of every single plate that you own and all these types of things. You just need to stick with the kind of the most valuable, the most sentimental items that you want to pass on.
Yeah. And then, so after we've done the gifts, the rest of your estate is known as your residue, if you will. So if after all the gifts, if there are any indeed gifts to come out of it, the rest of your estate is then distributed according to how you want. And most people, we find, tend to leave everything to their spouse. I mean, naturally it would go that way if you didn't have a will anyway. But we often think, again, what we talked about earlier is if that person wasn't there, it's always worth thinking about the sort of almost second and third level down of residue if, the first person you wanted to receive anything isn't there. So again, it's spouse generally, and then to children if you have any. But this is the point where, again, it needs to be written down in black and white so you don't fall into the realms of the unknown and things going where you might not want them to go. Yeah,
and this is where it always becomes a tricky conversation when you're talking to people, because they say, okay, they're the last surviving partner and they want it to go to their children equally. And then we start talking about, well, what happens if something happens to one of your children before you? And it's just thinking about all the kind of possibilities. And we're not saying that any of them are going to happen. And hopefully it will be whatever you've put down as your first option will happen, because that would obviously be the ideal scenario. But you just never know what life is going to throw at you, that actually having kind of some alternative options will just save you having to update and change your will with the smallest events kind of happening in life. So definitely a good idea to do. Another thing to think about is whether you are excluding somebody from your will, which might expect to be receiving something.
Yeah.
So it could be a child, a grandchild, it could be a spouse, it could be... You need to think about it very, very carefully. If they're financially dependent on you in any way, if you exclude them, they could still contest the will and rightfully benefit from your estate. But if they have no financial dependency on you whatsoever...
It's a bit more difficult, isn't it?
It's more difficult, and you might be choosing to exclude them for a particular reason. Now, there's two ways in which you can kind of do this. Number one could be you leave them something, but it could be a small token gesture, £100 or...
And I suppose from that point of view, at least it's a bit more difficult for them to say, I was forgotten about, let's say, because you've not forgotten. They're in the will.
They're in there in black and white. You haven't been forgotten. We've thought about you. And
even though it's a smaller gift, but you've covered them then, haven't you?
Yeah. The other way to do it is to basically name them in your will and say that I have deliberately not left this particular person anything. So I could say I deliberately have chosen not to leave anything to Lucas. Now, doing that, again, it shows that you haven't forgotten about them because you've named them in your will, but it could still be questioned. So what we always suggest to people is that they write a letter that goes alongside their will. It's a personal letter, so it's not something we would ever ask to see. But all we say to them is to write down their thoughts and feelings, the reasons that they've done this. And you want to try and keep it nice and friendly because at the end of the day, whoever's potentially going to be reading this letter, you're going to be leaving it to them after you're gone. And you don't want to cause more problems and drama after you've gone.
No.
But you want to be clear and concise about the reasons that you've done it to make it clear that you haven't done it and you really thought the situation through, and this is what my wishes really are. So it can be done, but it just, like I say, needs to be thought about quite carefully.
Yeah. I mean, so ultimately, the will can be really as simple or as complex as you want it to be. And I mean, the more complex wills we see are when people start putting in trusts and things like those in place. So, I mean, what would be the advantages, Emma, of putting the use of trust in a will? What would be the reason for doing that?
So it would tend to be to ideally protect your beneficiary, so whoever the money's going to. So it could be that, I don't know, they had a substance abuse problem, or it might be something a lot more lighthearted that actually they're just not particularly good with money, and you want to make sure that the gift that you leave them isn't just going to be frittered away. It could be that they're in a relationship and you don't particularly trust their partner, and you want to make sure that whatever you give them is ring-fenced for them, for their use, and not just wasted on unnecessary things. So in that case, you could put in place a trust to make sure that somebody oversees the looking after of that money, so it then gets used in the ways that you would approve of, basically. Or it could be other things, such as this is your second marriage and you want to make sure that your children are going to benefit from your first marriage, so you don't want to risk everything going to your spouse and then your children ultimately not getting anything because your spouse then changes their will and leaves everything to their children. So there's lots and lots of different things that you can do.
And you can set sort of age limits as well when the beneficiaries can, like you said, if at the point where you think they might be too young to receive some money, if the worst were to happen, you can pick a time, and the most usual times that we see are sort of age 18, 21, 25 to receive some money or a gift particularly.
Yeah. So there's loads and loads of different things that you can think about with your will. And like I say, you can be as specific and as you want to be, or you can be a little bit more relaxed and say, well, I'm not too worried. I ideally like this to happen. And after that, I don't mind too much as such. But you just need to make sure that what's important to you is written down, and to make sure that those wishes are carried out. Because like I said, without having a will, your estate will pass under the rules of intestacy, and families are very, very complex situations. I think we all have a complex family, whether or not we think it. We like to think we all have happy families, but there might be things that go on in your family, and actually under the rules of intestacy, the people that you want to benefit wouldn't be the ones to benefit. It's just really important to make sure that you've got it written down, it's signed, it's witnessed, everything is there. So one day if it happens, you've got everything in place.
It's a bit of peace of mind, isn't it? Knowing that, once you're gone, everything will be as you want it to be.
Exactly. And then it's really important to not just write your will and put it in a cupboard or in a safe or wherever you put it and forget about it forever. Because actually you do need to review these things and update these things. It could be you have more children. It could be someone in your will, your executor passes away and you want to update it and add another executor. So we always recommend that you review it every year. Some people think, well, that's far too often and think 5 years is enough. But it needs to just be a period that you're comfortable with. And it's not to say that you will ever need to update it. No. You could make a will and it could be in place for 25, 30 years. And actually it would still carry out your wishes exactly as you want them to be from day one to year 30 and beyond.
But they're not a final thing, are they? A lot of people, I think, when they think they write it and that's done. I mean, it's a snapshot in time ultimately. And as Emma said, some people's will may be almost valid or sufficient for 20, 25 years. But with the complexities of the modern world and change in families, things do change. So reviewing it, as Emma said, is really important.
Definitely. So if anyone's got any questions or anything else they want to know about wills, feel free to drop us some comments, send us some messages, and we'll be more than happy to help. If you've enjoyed listening today, why not head over and join our Facebook group, The Money Compass.
And if you have any questions for myself, Lucas,
or me, Emma,
drop us a message in this group.